Welcome to the lesson about the principles of assessment. The principles of assessment are important because they guide us on how to make our decisions as assessors, designers, and moderators. These principles, there are 11 of them, and they fall into 3 categories, and the categories are evidence, methods, and process, are the formal guidelines that we have to follow as assessors, designers, and moderators. The first category that I'm going to discuss are the principles that relate to the evidence that must be collected from the learners. Now, the first principle there is the principle of valid. That is to say, the evidence that we use to judge the learner must be a result of a realistic process. It is something that must match the actual job that that should take place. So a valid assessment, in other words, would be a realistic assessment. The next principle that we are going to look at is the principle of authentic. That means that the work that has been done must be attributable to the learner, so that the learner didn't copy from somebody else, so that the answers, the knowledge, the skills that they've shown are their own work. The next principle is that of current. That is to say that the evidence that we are using to make our decision should be based in the here and now, not in the past or in the future, the here and now. The learner must be capable, they must be competent now. The next principle is that of sufficient. That means you must collect evidence against all of the specific outcomes, all of the assessment criteria, all of the essential embedded knowledge, and all of the CCFOs. So if you haven't collected evidence against all of the criteria, your assessment would not be sufficient. Now, the sufficient actually also has a second portion. You as the assessor must also be sure that the learner would be able to repeat the performance. So sufficiency means covering all of the outcomes as well as making sure that the learner can repeat it. Now, these principles of assessment relating to the evidence are most important to the assessor, because the assessor is the one that collects the evidence from the learners. Now we are going to discuss the principles that relate to the methods of assessment. Now, you'll remember from earlier lessons that the methods of assessment are observation, questioning, and product evaluation. The first principle that we are going to look at is the principle of fairness. That means there must be no barriers introduced to the assessment that aren't required by the unit standard itself. So whenever you're thinking about how difficult an assessment must be, the assessment must only be as difficult as specified by the outcomes. Okay, so if you keep that in mind, then your assessment will be fair. The next principle is that of appropriateness. That means you must choose the correct method to do the assessment. So, for example, if you're doing a knowledge-based assessment, then your method should be questioning. If you are doing a practical assessment, your method should then be either observation or product evaluation. For example, if you're evaluating the learner on their ability to bake a cake, there will be elements where you observe them to see that they're maintaining hygiene properly, and then the product evaluation will come when you actually end up eating the cake. You know the saying, the proof is in the pudding. That would be, in this case, a product evaluation. Now, our next principle is that of integrated. Now, that means you must integrate your assessments as far as possible into either the work or the learning environment, so that assessment isn't a standalone activity. Our next principle of assessment is one that comes into conflict with the others on quite a few occasions, and that is the principle of manageability. Now, an assessment isn't a once-off thing. It is something that happens many times over many learners over a long period of time. So every effort must be made to make sure that these assessments are manageable. Now, when I say that the principle of manageability comes into conflict with the other principles, think of it this way. If you have an oral interview with the learner, that would be very authentic evidence. The learner wouldn't be able to copy the answers from someone else. However, it wouldn't be very manageable. For example, if it takes 5 minutes and you've got 10 learners, then the oral interview is going to end up taking 15 minutes. Whereas if you were giving the learners a written test, instead of it taking them 50 minutes, it would maybe only take them 5 to 10 minutes. So you've always got to keep in mind manageability. So the largest principle that the manageability also comes in conflict with is the principle of validity, because the more realistic an assessment is, the more expensive and effort it is to arrange it. Because at the end of the day, you want your assessments to be effective, that is to say that you're assessing the right things, and efficient, to make sure that your assessment doesn't use up more resources than are required. So these principles relating to the methods of assessment are most important to the designer, because they are the person who actually ends up creating the assessment itself. Our next category of principles is the principles relating to the overall process. This is where the moderator plays a very important role, because the moderator must make sure that the assessment process is being followed correctly. So there are 3 principles in this category. The first principle is that of consistent and reliable. That is to say that if I make a decision based on a learner from the evidence that they've given me, I should accept that same evidence from another learner as well. And another assessor should also be able to come to the same decision based on the same evidence that I've given. So essentially, there mustn't be favoritism. The next principle is that of open. That is to say that the learners must have the opportunity to provide input regarding their assessments. 2 very important areas where the learners need to give input would be special needs as well as recognition of prior learning. The principle of open is also why we have the pre-assessment briefing as well as the assessment plan, to make sure that the learner is adequately prepared before their assessment. Our last principle then is the principle of systematic. That is to say, we must follow the policies and procedures of our organization in a systematic fashion. The most important policies would be the assessment policy, the moderation policy, the RPL policy, as well as the special needs and irregularities policy and procedure. So to sum up, in total there are 11 principles of assessment. These principles of assessment are the rules that we need to follow, and also that the principles are related into 3 categories. The principles relating to the evidence, the principles that relate to the methods, as well as the principles that relate to the overall process. And then just to recap about the 11 principles, they are valid, authentic, current, sufficient, fair, appropriate, integrated, and manageable, as well as consistent, open, and systematic. Now, these principles of assessment, their formal definitions can be found in either the glossary in the course or on your copy of the Assessor Unit Standard, specifically on page 8. Okay, so answer then the questions using this information that I've given you, and on to the next lesson.